right, I'm going to be lazy today and sit down because I'm tired. I guess I should turn the projector on so you can see the PowerPoint. The technology's got nice when it works and when you remember what you're doing. That always helps too. Okay. All right, before we get sign-in sheet. Before we get started, if you haven't done the extra credit on Roanoke and you still want to, you have until tomorrow morning. Whenever I wake up in the morning, I'm cutting the test off. So there's that. Also, as I mentioned before, the English Civil War is not my strong suit. We will go through it, but I will also post a video on Blackboard. I will get that done today. And there will be an extra credit test if you want to take it. It will be up until at least Monday. Watch the video even if you're not going to do the extra credit test, because it will be on the test. Now, I don't have a copy of that schedule I gave y'all, so I can't remember how many days I said I was going to spend on British North America, but we're not to the end of it yet, so we're not taking the test yet. So that's pretty much how that's going to work. When we get to the end of the subject matter, that's when we'll take the test. You'll have at least 24 hours. So if it's on the schedule for today, which I'm kind of somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm thinking it is, don't stress about it. Because one, the test isn't even posted, and two, we're not going to take it until we're done with the material. So there, those are my announcements. Just a reminder to those who are watching online, please put your name in the comment if you want to be considered here today. I have a very, technical way of keeping track of that. I take a picture of it with my phone before I leave the classroom. If your name gets in that picture, then you're considered here for the day. So, all right. I am also going to lose, unless this offends you, I'm going to lose the mask. You're the closest one to me. But I think we're more than 6 feet apart. I woke up really thirsty this morning, so I'll probably drink this entire soda. All right, Indians in New England. We've already met a couple of the Indians in New England, or at least by name we met Squanto. The Indians that they met at Plymouth tended to be friendly, at least to begin with. But much like in the South, once the Indians figure out these white people are not leaving and they're starting to overrun our lands, they're not really all that great as trade partners, things are going to go south. In general, the tribes that we're talking about in Maine, it's the Abenakis that are hunters and gatherers. But if you'll remember when we talked about Maine, Maine is mostly fishing. There's not a lot of settlement in Maine, so there's not a lot of immediate clashing. The Algonquians are the ones that more of the tribes are more of the settlers are going to meet. Now, the Algonquians are an agricultural group, and it's made up of several tribes: the Massachusetts, the Nausetts, the Narragansetts. Remember, the Narragansetts are where Roger Williams fled to when he left Massachusetts, because he was either more religious or less religious, depending on your outlook. In his mind, more religious; in their mind, blasphemous. But he went and lived with the Narragansett Indians. They got along great. Then there's the Pequots and the Wampanoags. They were farmers, much like the incoming settlers wanted to be farmers. They had already cleared fields. This idea that the Indians, lived in harmony with nature is kind of a false idea. And it comes up again and again. We talked about it a little bit when we talked about South America. The buffalo was the supermarket of the Plains Indian. Well, it is. You can use almost any part of the buffalo. But if you kill 25 buffalo at one time, you're not going to use all of them. So, and on the East Coast, the easiest way to clear a field, if it's got trees on it, burn it down. The Indians did that. They would burn things to clear it. They used they didn't necessarily use the natural resources in a natural way, the way we kind of always imagine. Not that they were any worse than anybody else, but they weren't a whole lot better. As a group, all of these Indians, had the same kind of spiritual, religious beliefs that, there were spirits in nature, and they all pretty much believed that the Puritans were evil. Of course, Puritans believed the Indians were heathens, so it's kind of a fair swap. There are a couple of big wars that we're going to talk about. In 1636, Massachusetts settlers accused a Pequot Indian of murdering a colonist. So, in order to exact revenge, the settlers, joined by settlers from Connecticut, set fire to a Pequot village on the Mystic River, shot the Indians as they fled the fire. The Indians retaliate, because this is how wars go. You hit me, I hit you back, until it gets, way out of hand or somebody hits the hardest. The Pequot chief, Zacchaeus, organized their survivors and launched a counterattack. They were joined by the colonists are joined by the Narragansett Indians and kill hundreds of Pequot Indians over the next year. They take the survivors into slavery, sell them to Bermuda. You also have the same issues that are going on here that went on in South America, that went on in Virginia, the South, with disease. The Indians are not only fighting bullets, they're fighting disease, and they're fighting slavery. This is not unusual. They would fight among themselves. They would take slaves from each other's tribes. But now you have the added benefit of these people have ships, big seaworthy ships. They put them on the ships, they send them away. One of the problems with taking any native a slave and keeping them in the same area is they know the area better than you do. And they can slip away. So let's take them somewhere else. And we'll bring in slaves from somewhere else. So they end up doing that. They finally signed the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, which dissolves the Pequot Nation. The only person that actually condemned this was Roger Williams. And, he vocally condemned it, but most of the white settlers thought Roger Williams was a little crazy anyway. So he was definitely the voice of the minority, but at least there was a voice of the minority speaking out. The European settlers pretty quickly worked through the Indian tribes, either with wars or disease. They have peace for a while. The Indians are trade partners. They trade in furs, but you can only kill so many animals before you run out of animals. Again, this idea of working with nature doesn't always play out. There's letters. So this is an aside, just as an example. One of the things I work with at the fort are these letters from the Grierson family. And in these letters, so this is in the 1800s, 1870s to be more specific, she's writing to her sons, who both are living, one is at West Point and one is in Jacksonville, Illinois, telling them about their daily life. And in these letters leading up to Thanksgiving, she's telling them about all the hunting trips. Did y'all know we used to have antelope here? Yeah, antelope roamed wild in West Texas in the 1870s. We also had bear and buffalo, beaver. There were all kinds of animals. And she's writing to them, Daddy went out hunting and he shot 27 turkey and 5 antelope and 3 deer and lists us all off. Then the week before Thanksgiving, we haven't found any turkey for Thanksgiving, so it might be a turkeyless Thanksgiving this year. It's like, because you've shot them all already. You've been, sending these letters. Daddy shot 27 turkeys. Daddy shot 10 turkeys. There are like 4 letters leading up to that where they had shot turkeys in the double digits, and then the week before Thanksgiving, they can't find any. But yeah, we used to have a lot more wildlife in West Texas than we do now, and it's because we overhunted them. That's going to be the same on the East Coast. The fur trade had kept peace for a while, but as the colonies expanded, they're taking up more land. They're changing it into farmland. They're killing off the area, or they're destroying the habitat that the beaver need. Not only that, they're killing all the beaver. Beaver were a big thing because you can make lots of things out of beavers. Hats were big. Beaver skin hats were a big deal in the 1600s. So as that fades, you're having a little more tension. Not only that, but the colonies are trying the missionary approach, trying to convert the Indians. And this is led by a man named John Eliot, who calls himself the Apostle to the Indians. And they set up what they call praying towns, which are villages for the Indians to live in that have an English layout. They adopt English names, they cut their hair, they learn to be domestic. And of course, this is resented by a lot of the Indians. Some are okay with it, but a lot were not. Particularly the chief of the Wampanoags, Metacomet, who was known by the English as King Philip. One Indian's comment was, "Our corn is as good as yours, and we take more pleasure than you. Why should we adopt your ways?" And things are going to come to a head. In 1647, 74, one of the praying Indians, John Sassamone, warns the settlers that there's an upcoming war. He is found dead under a frozen pond a few months later. The Puritans, of course, believe the Indians murder him, and they find 3 Wampanoags guilty and hang them. So the Indians, again, you hit me, I hit you back, start burning Puritan farms. A few days after the farms are burned, an Englishman shoots an Indian. The Indians start beheading Puritans. And a war that's probably one of the most destructive in our history in proportion to population, as far as percentages, which I don't have the exact percentage, starts. People were retaliating left and right. Even Boston ends up being threatened by these Indians. Conscription laws are enacted, basically forcing people into military. But the Indians wear down first. Shortages of food and ammo, plus losses to casualties. Finally, King Philip's wife and son are captured and sold into slavery in Bermuda, which kind of takes the starch out of King Philip. The rest surrender or die of disease or just flee west. King Philip Metacomet is hunted down and killed in 1675. They, in good English fashion, they place his head on a pike, parade it through Plymouth, and set the pole in the ground to sit there for 20 years. As a reminder that you better not strike back. The English meant it when they started their little wars. The remaining villages will eventually be forced under English supervision, and they pretty much take care of the Indian issue in the New England colonies for at least a little while. Now, it is, and that is a very short, very sterile version of it. It was ugly. The Indians don't fight the way we fight. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare. There's a lot of sneaking up and beheading people. There's a lot of grisliness, but they at least come up with a peace for a little while. We're going to fight the Indians off and on for the next 1600, at least 200 years, in different versions. And the Indians are just, and this starts a pattern of just pushing the Indians west. Because as the settlers come in from the east and they're pushing west, they're pushing the Indians in front of them. All right, so we've settled the Indian problem in New England, just like we settled it in the South by killing most of them. While all of this is going on the other side of the ocean, there's some other things going on that affect the colonies because they are English colonies. These people are still Englishmen. They, if you walked up to a colonist, unless it's maybe Roger Williams, I know I keep bringing him up, but I think he's really actually kind of a cool person. They would all claim that they were Englishmen and that they had all the rights of Englishmen. But in England, some things are happening. By the 1640s, you've got English colonies on either side of Dutch New Netherland. So we've established that. We've got the New England colonies north. We've got Virginia and the stuff around Maryland, around the Chesapeake in the south. And they're clicking along okay. They have their Indian problems, but they're past the starving times. They're doing all right. But shortly after 1640, struggles between the king and parliament in England took attention away from colonization. People in England had been very interested in what was going on in the colonies. You know, it was a great business venture. It was a great place to escape if you had no other means of survival. You know, you could indenture yourself, go across the ocean. But the English Civil War is going to take a break, and it's not a long war. Well, it's the English Civil War itself is not long, but some of the after effects will be. So the English Civil War lasts from 1642 to 1646. Like I said, I am not good at explaining this. You really need to watch the video. But Charles the First gets tired of dealing with Parliament. I'm giving you the thumbnail version. So you've already gone through James. We're into Charles. Charles is leaning Catholic. He doesn't want to deal with Parliament. He thinks he should be able to rule by the grace of God. Parliament holds the purse strings, which is a lot of power. If you hold the money, you hold the power. Well, Charles doesn't really need to increase taxes, and he doesn't want Parliament making new laws. So basically, he doesn't call Parliament back into service, which, of course, pisses off Parliament. So you start having this big clash, and under Oliver Cromwell, who is the leader of the Puritan Roundheads. So you have the Roundheads that are supporting Parliament. You have the Cavaliers who are supporting the king. And you have an actual war. Parliament tries to and finally succeeds in arresting King Charles and beheading him. Things kind of click along for a while between 46 and 53. Charles II comes in as king, but there's restrictions on his abilities to rule. But even he tries to stretch things a little farther than he should. And eventually, in 1653, Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads take over the English government, and they call it's basically a dictatorship, but he calls it a protectorate. And Cromwell is like, he's not quite a separatist, but he's definitely a Puritan. And England goes through this really weird phase where a lot of for a while, they even outlawed Christmas. Mincemeat pies can't be made. So they make them square, so they're not technically a pie. It's a very, under your thumb type of a dictatorship. And eventually, enough of the Cavaliers and people in power Cromwell will die actually before this. When his rule ends is when he dies, and they're going to bring in another Mary, to take over as king and queen. But there's going to be more restrictions put on it. We already have the Magna Carta, but there's going to be more restrictions put on the king and queen. They have to call Parliament at least once every 3 years. It becomes more of what England is today. And becomes more of it doesn't become a republic, but it becomes more of a republic than it was. But while this is going on, things are kind of stalling in the New World. And like I said, watch the video. It will be a much, much more cohesive description of the English Civil War than what I just gave you. Because, like I said, I can't wrap my head around it. The colonies are left alone. I mean, there's more things on their mind in England right now than the colonists. They're fighting a war. There were actual battles. People die. And what the colonies are doing is kind of off the radar at the moment. So the colonies are left alone. Migration dwindles to a trickle. And while they're left alone, they figure out they need to defend themselves. So the New England Confederation is formed. It's formed to provide defense from the French, the Dutch, and the Indians. It's made up of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. 2 commissioners from each colony are to meet annually, and they act as a sovereign power. So while England is ignoring them, they're taking more power into their hands. Basically, the New England Confederation is acting like its own country. They make treaties, which is something only a country can do. Only an entire nation can make treaties. You can't have one part of it making treaties. That is not how that's supposed to work. They declare war against the Dutch in 1653. They blame the Dutch for inciting the Indian attacks against the Confederation, or against Connecticut, but just against Connecticut. Declaring war is another one of those powers that is supposed to be reserved for a nation. Not a part of a nation, but the whole nation. And this is going on without the blessing or consent of England. They're not asking, hey, is it okay with you if we do this? They're just doing it. So they're taking more, they're taking more powers upon themselves. And they're going to meet until 1684. So way after things settle down in England, they're still meeting. And they're going to do this until Massachusetts loses its charter. Virginia and Maryland become almost as independent. In 1649, Governor William Berkeley, so he's the governor of Virginia, denounces the execution of King Charles by the Puritans and recognizes Charles II as rightful heir and lawful king. This is before they actually put him back into power. In 1652, the Virginia Assembly overrules the governor and sides with Parliament. So you have a mini English Civil War breaking out in Virginia. Parliament, in return for their support, allows the Assembly to choose its own council and government. It also becomes because Berkeley was backing King Charles, becomes a friendly place for Anglicans. Not that it hadn't been before; it was already a Catholic Anglican area, and a lot of the people fleeing, even though migration has come to a trickle, the ones that were coming, a lot were coming to Virginia to escape the Civil War. In Maryland, you have the Toleration Act of 1649, which was suggested by the governor because there were starting to be a lot of difficulties with the Protestants in Catholic Maryland. Now, if you remember, Maryland was formed as a Catholic refuge, but they brought a lot of Protestants with them as servants, as workers, and eventually they outnumber the Catholics. And so you have a Protestant majority. So the Toleration Act assures that the Puritans could practice their religion without persecution. So you have one of the first, other than Roger Williams, really tolerant. We're going to be a Catholic colony, but if you want to be a Protestant, that's fine. We're not going to run you out. We're going to allow your churches to stand. You're just not going to get tax money. It's revoked in 1654 by Parliament, and Parliament deprives Lord Baltimore of his governing rights, which leads to a brief civil war, but it's going to eventually stand, because when Cromwell comes into power, he's going to reinstate Baltimore and the Toleration Acts. But they're starting to do things on their own. They're starting to pass more things than they did. I mean, the American colonies from the very beginning are taking liberties with the law, but now they're really acting as if they're independent. And that's very important. There was a little bit of interest under Cromwell. There's some trade wars with the Dutch that lead to some problems with the Navy. And in 1655, the English managed to take Jamaica from Spanish control, which gives them another, Bahamas type or Caribbean colony. It's another place we can send slaves and do trade. In 1660, when King Charles II is restored, most of the colonies are restored to their previous governments. England looks at the colonies and says, okay, we're going to go back before all of this started. Massachusetts gets reconfirmed. There's a new royal charter for Connecticut, a new royal charter for Rhode Island. Plymouth never did get a charter, but nobody really cared. And New Haven is absorbed into Connecticut. But the changes have already happened. In New England, they have this protection committee. In the South, they've allowed Puritans to worship openly in the Catholic colonies. So you're getting a lot of changes and a lot more independence. But once the wars stop, you get more colonies too. So, restoration of the king inspires more interest in colonial expansion. And we're going to work on, my notes are really weird. Why does it say that? Some areas, all right, I have a line in here. That second line, the New Netherlands, is cut up into, we're going to talk about that more later. But after King Charles II comes in, they are going to end up taking the Dutch colonies of New Netherlands, and they're going to cut it up into New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. But we're going to talk about them more in a minute. The area south of Virginia is the next area we're going to talk about. A lot of these colonies are going to be proprietary colonies, and they're going to be awarded to people who were loyal to the king, to the Cavaliers, to the people who supported Charles before he lost his head, and the second Charles when he came back. So I've always wondered, why would you want to be king after your father had just been beheaded? It just doesn't sound like a good job description, but whatever. So the Carolinas are awarded to 8 prominent allies who become Lord Proprietors. And you end up with 2 very separate areas of settlement. So you have this North Carolina area, and there's going to be some clashes over where exactly the border is, and the South Carolina area. Virginia actually wants to claim all the way down to here. They're not going to get to. Eventually, this is going to be sorted out. The North is called Albemarle, and had been they really start settling it in the 1650s. There's a lot of Virginians who had just drifted south. Remember, I talked about these are people who don't normally stay. If you had enough gumption to want to cross the ocean, once your land starts playing out, things it starts getting crowded, and we'll just move a little farther. So you have some drifters who would have come down from Virginia into this northern area. You had remote scattered farms along the shores of Albemarle Sound, which is that little spot that comes in. And they basically had just been living there. They don't have a governor until 1664, and their first assembly isn't established until 1665. The first real town isn't going to be settled until 1704, and that's going to be a group of French Huguenots, which are Protestants, who will settle at Bath on the outer banks of North Carolina. South Carolina was a little more promising. Can I switch? Not yet. Okay. South Carolina has a lot of coastal areas that are good for raising rice. They'll flood. There's a lot of rivers that come in. There was some promise of sugar plantations, and these English proprietors bring in planters from Barbados to transplant the West Indian sugar plantation system. And then they are going to switch to rice later. The first town, Charlestown, guess who that's named for? Guy who gives you all the land, which will become Charleston, is established in 1669. And they set up a constitution, the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which is going to be the government. It's drawn up by 2 people, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper and his secretary, John Locke. Now, John Locke is a name you're going to hear a lot while we're talking about this, as we establish the English colonies, and more importantly, as we establish the new United States of America, whenever we get to that point. John Locke is a political theorist. It is a cumbersome document. It provided for large land grants for the gentry, small head rights, which are small land grants for anyone who could afford transit, and it guaranteed religious toleration, even of Jews and heathens. So atheists were even welcome in this new colony of South Carolina. It will become a royal colony in 1719. North Carolina is not going to become a royal colony until 1729. It's going to take a little bit longer. Again, with the Indians, they start out okay. They have relationships with the local tribes, the Catawba, Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw. They start trading with the Indians. Of course, trade exposed them to disease. It also exposes them because they traded for firearms and alcohol, rum specifically. Rival tribes would capture slaves to trade to the English. And this is going to be okay for a while. But again, they're going to end up outstripping the animals that the land provides. And you're going to have another Indian war. This time you have the Tuscarora War. Ready? The Tuscarora War takes place in North Carolina, starts around 1712. The Yamasee were another tribe that they traded with, and they got bent out of shape because they didn't think that they were being paid enough by the settlers for Tuscarora captives. Now, the Yamasee were already in debt to the English. They were trading deerskins, and they would trade on credit. You know, I don't know, but let's just make up numbers. You know, a rifle was 5 deerskins, but I'm going to trade you. I'm going to give you the rifle now, and you owe me 5 deerskins. Well, by 1712, they were about 5 years debt of hunting, which was about 100,000 deerskins. Now, between 1699 and 1650, South Carolina is going to export over 50,000 deerskins to England, which just about exterminates the deer population. And the Indians are in debt to the colonists for twice that amount. Deerskins were very popular in England. You could use them for book bindings, hats, gloves, belts, work aprons. The leather was very useful. But I said, they pretty much exterminate the deer population. So when you start running out of deer, you start trading in slaves. And they would raid other tribes. They would raid into French and Spanish holdings as well. And then the whites start taking land. And they started taking captives of the Yamasee. So the Yamasee attacked the coastal plantation, killing over 100 whites. They're aided by the Creek. The colonists retaliate. All males are mobilized, including the African slaves. And they're joined by the Cherokee. And between the Carolinians and the Cherokee, they managed to run the Yamasee and the Creek out of South Carolina and into Florida. To avoid another situation like this, the government outlaws all trade with the Indians except through colonial agencies. Colonial agency was now the only way to trade, and they would only trade in deerskins. They would no longer trade in slaves. It doesn't stop the fighting, but it slows it down some. And it makes it an easier way for the colonists to justify what attacks they do make. All right, the next section we're going to talk about is those middle colonies, what we take from the Dutch. And because we only have 3 minutes left, I'm not going to attempt to try to do that. So we will talk about that on Monday. Y'all have a fabulous weekend. I plan to sleep a lot. And I'll see y'all then. So next week is when they're supposed to decide whether or not we stick with this hybrid, or they're supposed to evaluate it next week. Hopefully it's our last week of hybrid, but don't hold your breath.